Get on your knees. Now. The command cut through the terminal like a blade made of air, sharp but invisible, and for a moment, the entire concourse seemed to hold its breath as rolling suitcases slowed. Conversations faded, and 100 passing glances converged on a single point beneath the harsh white lights of Gate C-17, where Marcus Reed stood frozen, one hand still gripping the strap of his worn duffel bag, the other slowly lifting in compliance as if moving through water instead of air, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion that hadn't yet left his bones, the kind that clung after nights without sleep and miles without rest. His plain gray hoodie creased from travel, his boots marked with dust that didn't belong to any American city, and yet none of that was what the officers saw as they approached him with measured steps, their posture rigid, their voices controlled, their eyes already certain before a single question had been answered, because to them he matched something, some description, some assumption that had already decided the outcome before the moment even began, and Marcus could feel it not in what they said but in how they stood, how the distance between them closed not with curiosity, but with conclusion, and as one officer, Daniel Hayes, badge polished, jaw set, gestured toward the floor again with a sharper edge, Marcus lowered himself slowly, deliberately, his knees meeting the cold tile with a quiet pressure that echoed louder in his chest than in the space around him. The hum of overhead lights flickering faintly as if reacting to the tension that now stretched thin across the terminal. A child nearby, pausing mid-step, clutching a small stuffed animal, watching not with fear, but with a kind of quiet confusion, as if trying to understand why a man who looked so calm was being treated like something dangerous. And Marcus noticed that too. The way innocence lingered longer than judgment. The way that child's gaze didn't carry the weight of assumption, and for a fraction of a second, something softer passed through him before it settled back into stillness. Because stillness was what he had learned, what he had trained into every breath and every heartbeat. The discipline to remain composed when everything around him leaned toward chaos. And even now, with eyes on him, voices rising in low murmurs, phones subtly lifted at a distance, he did not resist, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply breathed, slow and steady, as if each inhale measured something deeper than the moment itself, while Officer Hayes circled slightly, speaking into his radio with clipped precision, words like detain, possible threat, and hold position dissolving into static that buzzed faintly against the edges of Marcus's hearing, and somewhere in that layered noise, in that blend of authority and assumption, Marcus understood exactly what had already happened, not in action but in perception, because this wasn't about what he had done, it was about what they believed he might be, and that belief had already shaped the reality unfolding around him. And yet even then, as the seconds stretched longer than they should, as the terminal's rhythm faltered and bent around this single moment, Marcus Reed remained exactly where he was, grounded, composed, his gaze steady but not defiant, his posture firm but not aggressive, carrying a quiet presence that did not ask for understanding but did not surrender to misunderstanding either. And beneath the sterile glow of airport lights, with the distant echo of boarding announcements barely cutting through the silence, the moment held, suspended, waiting for something unseen to shift. Marcus Reed did not look at the officers as they moved around him, but he saw everything in the reflections instead, in the polished floor beneath his knees, in the faint mirror of a glass storefront across the terminal where shapes bent and shifted with every step taken toward him. And in those reflections he saw the rhythm of control, the way Officer Hayes positioned himself just slightly ahead of the others, the way the second officer adjusted his stance like someone trained to expect resistance even when none had been given, and Marcus understood that rhythm because he had lived inside different versions of it for years, in places where hesitation could cost more than pride, and where reading a room meant reading the space between heartbeats. And yet here, in this bright American airport filled with the low hum of announcements and the distant roll of luggage wheels, the tension felt different, heavier in a quieter way, because it was not built on danger but on assumption. And assumption was harder to break than any physical barrier. So he remained still, letting the moment breathe around him, his hands open, his posture grounded, his eyes steady but lowered just enough to avoid feeding the narrative already forming in the minds around him. And as Officer Hayes spoke again, asking for identification in a tone that sounded more like confirmation than inquiry. Marcus responded without hesitation, his voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone who had learned that volume did not equal authority. "My identification is in my left pocket," he said clearly, each word spaced with intention, not rushed, not defensive, just precise. And there was a pause, small but noticeable, the kind that happens when expectation meets something it did not prepare for, because Hayes had expected tension, maybe even defiance, but not this quiet control, and for a fraction of a second, the officer's gaze shifted, not softer, not understanding, but recalibrating. And he nodded to the other officer who stepped forward to retrieve the wallet, movements deliberate, careful, as if handling something unpredictable. Even though Marcus had not moved an inch, and when the wallet opened, the plastic card inside caught the overhead light, a standard-issue military identification, clean, official, unmistakable to anyone trained to recognize it. But recognition is not always acceptance, and Hayes glanced at it briefly before handing it back with a slight tightening of his jaw, as if the information did not align with the conclusion he had already chosen, and Marcus saw that too, the way facts sometimes failed to penetrate belief when belief had already decided the story. And around them the terminal continued to shift, people slowing as they passed, some pretending not to look, others watching openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment, and Marcus felt none of it settle into him, not because it did not exist, but because he had learned long ago that absorbing it would change nothing except himself, and that was a cost he refused to pay. So instead he focused on the small things. The steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint vibration of his phone still resting in his pocket, the distant voice announcing a boarding call for a flight he was supposed to be on, a flight that now felt like it belonged to someone else's day. And in that stillness, with the air around him thick but unmoving, Marcus Reed remained exactly who he was, not defined by the position he was placed in but by the control he chose to hold. And as Officer Hayes stepped closer again, preparing to move the situation forward in a direction he believed he controlled, there was a quiet certainty in Marcus that this moment, as fixed as it seemed, had not yet reached its final shape. Officer Daniel Hayes did not like the stillness, not the kind that came from compliance, but the kind that felt controlled, deliberate, as if the man kneeling in front of him was not reacting to the situation but observing it, measuring it in ways Hayes could not see, and that unsettled him more than any raised voice ever could. So he shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance, letting authority fill the silence where certainty had begun to thin, his hand resting near his radio as he spoke again, this time louder, not because it was necessary, but because volume often replaced doubt. "You are coming with us for further questioning," he said, each word firm, final, as if the decision had already been signed somewhere invisible. And the second officer stepped closer, gesturing toward the secured corridor that led away from the public terminal, a place where questions became statements and explanations arrived too late to matter. And Marcus Reed lifted his head just enough to meet Hayes's eyes for the first time, not challenging, not pleading, just present, fully aware. And in that brief connection there was something that did not fit the moment, something steady and unshaken, like a line drawn beneath everything that had already happened. And Marcus rose slowly to his feet when instructed, his movements smooth, unhurried, as if time still belonged to him even now. And as they began to guide him forward, the terminal seemed to part around them, people stepping aside, without being asked, their attention lingering just long enough to form quiet conclusions before they returned to their own lives. And Marcus felt the shift in space, the way the air changed as they moved from open light into the narrower corridor beyond the gate area, where the brightness dimmed slightly and the sounds of travel faded into something more contained, more controlled, the hum of fluorescent lights replacing the distant announcements. And with each step, the narrative around him tightened, not in reality, but in perception, and Hayes walked half a step ahead now, leading, his posture rigid with purpose, speaking briefly into his radio again, codes and fragments slipping through static. And somewhere in that exchange, Marcus caught the tone, the underlying tension of someone who believed he was right, but needed confirmation to silence the part of his mind that was no longer completely certain. And that was when Marcus spoke, his voice low but clear, cutting through the corridor without force. "Officer," he said, and Hayes did not stop, but he slowed just enough to acknowledge the interruption. "You are making a mistake," Marcus continued, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, calm, grounded, carrying no urgency because urgency was not needed. And for a brief second, Hayes glanced back, his expression tightening, a flicker of irritation crossing his face as if the words challenged not his authority, but his narrative, and he responded quickly, almost reflexively, "We will determine that," and kept walking, reinforcing the structure he believed he controlled. But Marcus did not push further, did not repeat himself, because he understood something Hayes did not, that truth did not need repetition to exist. And as they reached the secured door at the end of the corridor, the kind that required clearance to open, the kind that separated public space from controlled environment, Marcus felt the faint vibration of his phone again against his side, a small, persistent reminder that there were layers to this moment that had not yet been touched, and he knew, with a certainty that did not show on his face, that what was unfolding was not the full story, not even close. And as the door clicked open with a soft mechanical sound and the officers guided him inside, away from the eyes of the terminal and into a quieter, more contained space, the air shifted again, heavier now, more deliberate, and in that enclosed stillness, where assumptions felt stronger because they were no longer being watched, Marcus Reed remained composed, carrying a calm that did not come from the situation, but from something far beyond it, something that had already begun to turn the direction of everything that was about to follow. The room they led him into was smaller than it should have been for something that carried so much authority, a square of muted gray walls and a metal table anchored to the floor, the kind of space designed not for comfort but for control, where every sound echoed just enough to remind you that you were contained. And as the door closed behind them with a soft but final click, the outside world disappeared completely. No rolling luggage, no distant announcements, just the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet shifting of bodies adjusting to a new dynamic. And Marcus Reed took in the room in a single glance, not searching for exits, but for patterns, for the way the officers positioned themselves, for the subtle hierarchy in their movements, for the tension that lingered in the air like something unspoken. And Officer Hayes moved to the opposite side of the table, placing both hands flat against the surface as if grounding himself in the authority he believed he held, his expression firm but tighter now, the confidence from the terminal pressed into a narrower shape under the weight of this enclosed space. And the second officer remained near the door, arms crossed, watching, silent but present, and Marcus stood where they had stopped him, not sitting, not shifting, simply waiting, his posture relaxed but intentional, as if he had stepped into a different kind of operation altogether, one where patience carried more weight than movement. And Hayes began again, his voice measured but edged with something sharper. "We are going to ask you a few questions," he said, the phrasing controlled but not truly optional. And Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the structure without surrendering to it. And there was a pause, a brief moment where Hayes seemed to expect more, some form of explanation or defense, but none came, and that absence stretched the silence longer than intended, forcing Hayes to fill it himself. "What is the purpose of your travel today?" he continued, and Marcus answered without hesitation, his tone even, unembellished, "Returning home." And the simplicity of the response seemed to irritate more than satisfy, because it did not expand, did not justify, did not align with the narrative Hayes had already begun constructing. And he leaned slightly forward, narrowing his gaze. "And where exactly is home?" And Marcus met his eyes again, steady, unwavering. "Virginia," he said. And again the answer landed without resistance, without detail. And again it left space where Hayes expected something else, something he could challenge, something he could dismantle. But Marcus offered nothing unnecessary, and that was where the tension shifted, not in volume, not in action, but in control. Because control did not always belong to the one asking the questions, and Hayes felt that, even if he could not name it, the subtle imbalance forming beneath the surface of what should have been a straightforward exchange, and he exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance, recalibrating. "You understand why you are being held here," he said, and Marcus's response came just as calm, just as grounded. Because you believe I am a threat, and the clarity of that statement hung in the room for a moment, heavier than any accusation, because it removed the illusion of neutrality and placed the situation exactly where it stood. And Hayes did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening slightly, as if the words had exposed something he preferred to keep unspoken, and the second officer shifted near the door, glancing briefly between them, sensing the shift even without understanding it. And in that quiet, contained space, with nothing left to distract from the reality unfolding between them, Marcus Reed stood composed, centered, carrying a presence that did not rise to meet pressure but absorbed it without change. And as the seconds stretched and the questions continued to circle, without finding their mark, there was an unspoken realization beginning to form, subtle but undeniable, that this situation, as controlled as it appeared, was not moving in the direction they had expected, and somewhere beneath the surface, something else was waiting, something that had not yet been brought into the room but was already beginning to shape everything inside it. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched first, thin and fragile, as if the room itself was waiting to see who would move next, and Officer Hayes finally did, pushing himself upright from the table with a controlled exhale, his fingers tapping once against the metal surface before he turned slightly toward the second officer, a subtle signal. And within seconds the rhythm of the room shifted again as procedure replaced conversation, because when questions failed to produce the outcome expected, authority often leaned into process, and the second officer stepped forward, requesting Marcus to place his belongings on the table, his tone firm but measured, and Marcus complied without hesitation, removing his duffel bag first, then his phone, placing each item carefully, deliberately, as if even now precision mattered, as if every movement carried weight beyond the room they were in. And Hayes watched closely, his eyes tracking each action, searching for something out of place, something that would confirm what he already believed. And the bag was opened, its contents laid out one by one, neatly folded clothes, a small toiletry kit, a sealed envelope with military markings that Hayes paused on just long enough to register, but not long enough to fully understand. And then the second officer reached for Marcus's phone, turning it over in his hand, examining it as though it might reveal something hidden simply by being held. And that was when Marcus spoke again, not louder, not sharper, but with a clarity that settled into the room like a line drawn across the moment. "I need to make a call," he said, and the words did not rush, did not plead. They landed with intention, and Hayes looked up immediately, his expression tightening, the request colliding with the control he had worked to maintain. "That is not happening right now," he responded quickly, almost too quickly, as if denying the request reinforced the structure he believed he still commanded. But Marcus did not react, did not push. He simply repeated, just once, "It is important." And there was something in the way he said it, not urgency, not fear, but certainty, the kind that did not rise from the situation but from something already in motion beyond it. And Hayes hesitated, a fraction of a second, barely visible, but real, because uncertainty had begun to slip into the edges of this encounter, and he covered it the only way he knew how, by reinforcing procedure. "You will have an opportunity later," he said, his tone firmer now, final, and he gestured for the second officer to continue, and the phone was set aside on the table, just out of Marcus's reach, its screen dark but present, a small object holding more weight than anyone in the room was willing to acknowledge. And Marcus's gaze shifted to it briefly, not with frustration, not with urgency, but with awareness, as if he understood that the distance between his hand and that phone was not physical, but procedural, and procedures could change, and the room settled again into a quieter tension, heavier now, layered with something unspoken, because beneath the surface of control, beneath the structure of questions and searches, there was a growing realization that this situation was no longer as simple as it had appeared in the terminal, that something had been missed, something not visible in identification cards or travel plans, something that sat quietly beneath Marcus Reed's calm presence, waiting. And as Hayes picked up the sealed envelope again, turning it slightly in his hands, his eyes narrowing as he read the markings more carefully this time, the room shifted once more, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, like a door that had not yet opened but was no longer fully closed. And Marcus stood there, unmoving, his breathing steady, his posture unchanged, carrying a quiet patience that did not come from compliance, but from knowing that moments like this had a way of revealing themselves, not when forced, but when allowed to unfold. The room grew quieter not because anyone asked for silence, but because something in the air demanded it, a subtle shift that settled into the walls and pressed gently against every movement, every breath, as if time itself had slowed just enough to make each second feel deliberate. And Marcus Reed stood exactly where he had been, his hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze resting somewhere between the table and the far wall, not avoiding eye contact, but not chasing it either, grounded in a stillness that did not belong to the situation but existed independently of it. And Officer Hayes remained across from him, the sealed envelope now resting in his hands again, his thumb brushing lightly across the edge where the official markings caught the overhead light, the insignia faint but unmistakable to someone who had seen enough government documentation to recognize its weight. And yet recognition did not immediately translate into understanding, and that gap was where the tension lived now, quiet but expanding, and Hayes hesitated, not outwardly, not enough for it to be obvious, but internally, a pause that stretched just long enough to disrupt the certainty he had carried into the room, and he placed the envelope back onto the table with a controlled motion, as if setting it down would also set aside the questions beginning to form in his mind. But they did not leave, they lingered, threading through his thoughts as he exhaled slowly and shifted his stance again. And the second officer near the door adjusted his position as well, glancing briefly at Hayes before looking back at Marcus, sensing the change even if he could not define it, and the fluorescent lights above flickered once, softly, the hum growing slightly louder in the brief pause that followed. And in that moment, with no one speaking, the room seemed to narrow, not physically, but perceptually, drawing focus inward to the smallest details, the faint crease in Marcus's sleeve, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his phone sat on the table just out of reach, silent but present, and Marcus's attention drifted to it again, not with urgency, but with quiet awareness, as if the distance between them carried meaning beyond inches. And he took a slow breath, the kind that settled deeper than the lungs, the kind that anchored rather than reacted, and for a brief second his eyes closed, not in frustration, not in resignation, but in something closer to reflection, as if he had stepped momentarily outside the room without moving at all. And when he opened them again, nothing in his expression had changed, but something in the atmosphere had, subtle but undeniable, like a current shifting direction beneath still water, and Hayes noticed it, not consciously, not in words, but in the way his posture stiffened slightly, in the way his gaze lingered longer than necessary, searching for something he could not quite name, and the silence stretched again, longer this time, heavy but not oppressive, filled with the weight of what had not yet been said, and in that stillness, the structure of the situation began to feel less certain, less fixed, as if the lines that had defined it at the start were no longer holding their shape, and Marcus remained exactly where he was, composed, patient, carrying a calm that did not demand attention but quietly reshaped it. And as the seconds passed, each one settling deeper into the moment than the last, it became clear, though no one said it out loud, that whatever was about to happen next would not come from force or procedure, but from something far quieter, far more precise, something already set in motion beyond the walls of that room, moving closer with every breath they took. The shift did not announce itself with noise or urgency. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, in the faint vibration of a radio clipped to Officer Hayes's shoulder, a small interruption that cut through the stillness like a thread being pulled loose, and Hayes turned slightly, pressing the button with a reflex that came from habit rather than thought, his voice low as he responded. But the reply that came back was not routine. It carried a different tone, sharper, more precise, and though the words were partially lost in static, one phrase landed clearly enough to change the air in the room. Confirm identity immediately, and Hayes's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, his eyes shifting toward Marcus before returning to the radio, asking for clarification, his voice controlled but tighter now. And the response came again, this time clearer, slower, as if each word was being placed carefully, deliberately. Name, Marcus Reed. Status, active. Clearance level classified. Do not detain. And the final words lingered longer than the rest, echoing not in sound but in meaning. And for a moment Hayes did not move, his hand still resting against the radio, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond Marcus as the information settled into place, not fitting the narrative he had constructed, not aligning with the assumptions that had carried him through the last several minutes. And the room shifted with him. The second officer near the door straightening slightly, sensing the change without yet understanding it. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, as if the moment unfolding had always been part of a larger sequence he had already accepted. And Hayes lowered his hand slowly, the radio now silent again, but no less present. And he looked at Marcus fully this time, not through the lens of suspicion, not through the structure of procedure, but directly, searching for something that matched what he had just heard. And for the first time, there was uncertainty in that gaze, real and unguarded, because authority, when confronted with contradiction, does not disappear, it hesitates, it recalibrates. And Hayes took a small step back from the table, his breathing shifting slightly, the rhythm no longer as controlled as before, and his eyes moved to the items laid out in front of him, the identification, the phone, the sealed envelope, each one now carrying a different weight than it had moments ago. And he reached for the envelope again, this time opening it with a careful motion, as if aware that what was inside would not just provide information, but confirm something larger. And the contents slid out, official documents, marked, precise, unmistakable in their formatting and language. And as Hayes read, the tension in his shoulders changed, not disappearing, but redirecting, moving inward. And the second officer stepped closer, glancing over, his own expression shifting as the pieces began to align. And the room, once tight with control, now held something else, something quieter but far more significant. The realization of error, of misjudgment, of a situation that had moved beyond their initial grasp. And Hayes looked up again, meeting Marcus's gaze. And this time there was no command in his posture, no immediate response, just a pause, a moment where the structure he had relied on no longer provided the answers he needed. And in that pause, Marcus spoke, his voice calm, steady, unchanged from the moment this began. I asked to make a call, he said, not as a reminder, not as a challenge, but as a continuation, as if the moment had simply caught up to what he had already known. And Hayes did not respond immediately, but the shift was complete now, visible in the way his stance softened, in the way his gaze dropped briefly before returning, in the way the room itself seemed to exhale without sound, because the truth had entered the space, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a precision that left no room for interpretation, and nothing inside that room would move the same way. Again, the room did not return to what it had been before. It could not, because once certainty breaks, it does not rebuild the same way. It reshapes into something quieter, something heavier. And Officer Hayes stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the document still in his hand, his grip no longer firm but careful now, as if the paper itself carried consequence. And the second officer stepped back slightly, creating space without being told, instinctively adjusting to a hierarchy that had just shifted without a word. And Hayes finally moved, placing the documents back onto the table with a precision that bordered on restraint, his eyes lowering briefly before lifting again to meet Marcus Reed's gaze. And when he spoke, the tone was different, not stripped of authority, but no longer anchored in it. Mr. Reed, he said, the name now used correctly, intentionally, as if acknowledging something that should have been recognized from the beginning. And there was a pause after it, a small but significant one, where the weight of what had already happened settled between them. And Marcus remained still, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, not expecting anything, not demanding anything, simply present. And Hayes exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly. You are free to go, he continued, the words measured, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent that had not been there before, something closer to awareness than certainty. And the second officer moved quickly now, almost too quickly, reaching for Marcus's belongings, placing the phone back in front of him, sliding the duffel bag closer, each motion careful, deliberate, as if correcting something that could not fully be undone, and Marcus looked down at the phone for a brief second before picking it up, his fingers wrapping around it with the same steady control he had maintained throughout, and for a moment, nothing else happened, the room holding in that quiet space between action and resolution. And then Hayes spoke again, softer this time, not rehearsed, not procedural, but real. There was a report, he said, as if explanation might balance what had already unfolded, but the sentence did not continue. It faded, unfinished, because even he seemed to recognize that the reason no longer held the same weight as the outcome. And Marcus lifted his gaze to him once more, not with judgment, not with anger, but with something far more grounded, something that did not rise above the moment, but moved through it. And when he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been from the beginning, calm, steady, unwavering. "You did not see me," he said. The words simple, direct, carrying no edge but leaving no space for misinterpretation, and Hayes did not respond, not immediately. His eyes lowering again for a fraction of a second, the truth of that statement settling deeper than any explanation could reach, and the second officer shifted near the door, opening it quietly, the hallway beyond visible again, the outside world waiting just on the other side of that threshold, and Marcus picked up his bag, slinging it over his shoulder with a smooth, practiced motion, his phone now in his hand, and he stepped forward, not hurried, not delayed, just moving at his own pace, and as he passed Hayes, there was no further exchange, no extended moment, just a brief alignment of presence. One man still recalibrating, the other already beyond the need to, and Marcus walked out of the room, back into the corridor where the light felt different now, not brighter, but clearer, and behind him, the room remained, quieter than before, carrying the imprint of a moment that had shifted more than just procedure. And as the door closed again with a soft, final sound, the weight of what had happened did not disappear. It stayed, settling into the space, into the silence, into the realization that some mistakes do not echo loudly. They linger quietly, long after the moment has passed. The corridor outside felt wider than before, though nothing about its structure had changed, the same polished floors stretching ahead, the same overhead lights casting their steady glow. But the air carried something different now, something quieter, less charged. As Marcus Reed stepped forward with an even pace, his boots landing softly against the tile, each step measured, unhurried, as if time had returned to its natural rhythm the moment he crossed that threshold, and behind him, the closed door stood still, holding everything that had just happened within its frame, a moment already beginning to settle into memory for those inside. But for Marcus, it did not follow him. It did not cling, because he had already let it go before it even ended. And as he moved further down the corridor, the distant sounds of the terminal began to return, first faint, then clearer, the rolling of luggage wheels, the echo of voices layered over one another, the occasional announcement breaking through the background like a distant wave. And when he stepped back into the open space of the terminal, the world continued exactly as it had before, people moving, talking, waiting, unaware of the shift that had just taken place behind closed doors, unaware of how close assumption had come to rewriting something it did not fully understand. And Marcus adjusted the strap of his bag slightly on his shoulder, a small motion, habitual, grounding, and his phone remained in his hand, the screen still dark, no urgency left in it now, just presence. And for a brief moment, he paused near the edge of the concourse, not because he had to, but because the stillness found him again, the same quiet center he had carried through every part of the moment before, and his eyes moved across the space, not searching, not scanning, just observing, the way he always had, taking in the details others overlooked, the patterns beneath movement, the silence beneath sound. And then he continued walking, blending back into the flow without resistance, without announcement, just another traveler moving toward a gate, toward a destination, toward something beyond this place, and somewhere behind him, far enough to no longer be seen, but not far enough to be forgotten. A voice crackled faintly through a radio, low, controlled, carrying words that did not need to be loud to carry weight. Internal review has been initiated, and the message passed through the system quietly, without spectacle, without disruption, just a shift, a correction beginning in the background, and Marcus did not turn, did not react, because whatever needed to be understood would be understood in its own time. And as he approached the next terminal, the light shifted again, softer now through the wide windows that framed the runway beyond, planes lined in the distance, waiting, moving, continuing, and Marcus Reed walked forward into that light, his figure steady, his presence unchanged, leaving behind a moment that would linger not in noise, but in the silence it created, the kind of silence that stays long after the sound has gone.